Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. Unlike the American or French revolutions, Caribbean independence didn't hinge on a single influential speech. It was a wave of political oratory across multiple colonies, often tied to labour movements, anti-colonial nationalism and federation debates. The key speeches tended to circulate regionally via radio and newspapers, influencing activists across the islands. Probably the most famous independence speech in the British Caribbean was made in 1961 in Trinidad and Tobago. Eric Williams's use of the phrase "Massa Day Done" signalled the psychological end of colonial domination. He connected slavery, plantation economy and colonial governance to modern inequality and argued independence was the logical historical conclusion. Norman Manley's speeches throughout the 1950s to 1962 wasn't one single iconic address, but a series arguing that Caribbean people were capable of self-rule and regional unity. He covered the key themes of political maturity of Caribbean societies, with the creation of a federation as a step toward independence. His speeches during the Jamaican independence debates shaped how elites across the region framed constitutional transition: gradual, legalistic, and respectable rather than revolutionary. Errol Barrow emphasised that independence was not anti-British but pro-Barbadian. From 1965 to 66, this Barbadian famously argued that independence meant control over our domestic destiny, with themes on economic modernisation, social democracy, education and welfare as independence goals and psychological emancipation. He said, and I quote, "We will be friends of all and satellites of none." British Guyana's independence struggle was more confrontational. Throughout the 1950s and early 60s, both Cheddi Jagan and Forbes Burnham gave fiery speeches linking colonial rule to economic exploitation, independence to workers' rights, and Cold War politics to Caribbean autonomy. Jagan and Burnham's speeches spread a radical populist tone that contrasted with the constitutional moderation of islands like Barbados and Jamaica. Veer Bird's speeches emerged directly from union organising and strikes during a 20-year period from the 1940s to the 1960s. The Antiguan framed independence as an extension of workers' liberation, a rejection of plantation oligarchies and social revolution more than a political one. This Labour-first framing resonated strongly in similar islands. As leader of the West Indies Federation, Grantley Adams gave speeches arguing that independence required regional unity. Though the Federation collapsed, his rhetoric from 1958 to 1962 influenced later Caribbean integration efforts, such as CARICOM and the regional courts. His speeches shaped a lasting debate about what was important: independence island by island versus independence as a Caribbean civilization. Even though the leaders differed ideologically, their speeches repeated several core arguments: the need for psychological emancipation, colonialism as a mental condition, not just a political structure, labour dignity, independence tied to workers' rights and social reform, historical justice, slavery and plantation economy used to justify sovereignty, respectability and competence, proof Caribbean societies could govern themselves responsibly, and nation building over rebellion, independence framed as maturity, not revolt. These speeches also popularised anti-colonial language in mass politics broadcasting, not just regionally, but also widely quoted in other colonies, becoming rhetorical templates for independence as dignity and not just constitutional change. This was the reason why they were not only necessary, but also why they mattered. The language of Caribbean and that of African independence was also deeply shaped by race and class, because colonial rule itself was organised around racial hierarchy and economic inequality. Independence speeches were not only arguments against empire, they were attempts to redefine social order inside the colonies. Leaders had to speak simultaneously to working class populations descended from enslaved or colonised peoples and to middle class elites trained within colonial institutions. This tension shaped both the tone and message behind the rhetoric. Race functioned as a central emotional and symbolic axis. Colonial systems justified domination through racial ideology, portraying European civilization as superior. Independence rhetoric therefore presented a balance to this ideology, emphasizing dignity, pride, and historical correction. Caribbean leaders frequently invoked slavery to connect modern political struggle with centuries of racial oppression, and phrases about holding heads high or rejecting the colonial mentality were attempts to undo internalized racism. These speeches aimed to transform identity from subject to citizen, from racial inferiority to cultural legitimacy. In African contexts, racial language was often even more explicit, presenting independence as the restoration of African humanity after dehumanization. However, class dynamics complicated this racial unity. Many independence leaders, such as Norman Manley, were Western educated professionals, lawyers, teachers, civil servants, who belonged to a small colonial middle class. They had to persuade working class populations that independence would improve material life, not just replace white rulers with local elites. As a result, speeches frequently adopted the language of labour dignity and social welfare. Caribbean rhetoric in particular drew heavily from trade union traditions. Leaders such as Eric Williams and Vera Bird framed independence as an extension of workers' rights, promising education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. This helped build cross-class coalitions by linking nationalism to social justice. At the same time, independence rhetoric often balanced radical and moderate impulses. Middle-class leaders reassured colonial authorities and business elites that independence would not mean chaos or revenge. This produced a careful tone, anti-colonial but orderly, proud but respectable. Race was mobilised as a unifying identity, while class conflict was softened into promises of national development. In Africa, where settler colonialism and land inequality were more severe in countries like Zimbabwe, rhetoric sometimes leaned more openly toward class confrontation and redistribution. The result was a language that tried to hold together multiple audiences. Independence speeches presented racial solidarity as a foundation for national unity while using class-conscious language to promise social transformation. They had to inspire the poor without alienating the powerful, condemn colonial injustice without destabilising fragile political transitions. This balancing act shaped the distinctive style of decolonisation rhetoric, emotionally charged yet controlled, radical in memory but cautious in policy. Ultimately, race gave independence rhetoric its moral urgency, while class gave it its economic programme, and together they turned speeches into blueprints for not only new governments, but also new societies. The struggle was not only to end foreign rule, but to redefine who belonged, who held power, and what justice would mean for post-colonial nations. Independence and its struggles and defining its purpose didn't end in the 1960s, though. In this, the current era of globalisation, dignity, economic control, psychological freedom, and resistance to domination continue to remain as themes that shape Caribbean and African independence speeches. Political independence did not end global inequality. Instead, many post-colonial thinkers argue that colonial power transformed into new economic relationships that continue to shape former colonies. The language of independence has evolved into debates about globalisation, debt, trade, migration, and cultural identity. Leaders of the independence era warned about neo-colonialism, a term popularised by Kwame Nkrumah and later expanded by scholars such as Walter Rodney. Neo-colonialism describes a situation where countries are formally independent but remain economically dependent on powerful nations and global corporations. Today, this concern appears in discussions about international loans, trade agreements, tourism economies, and multinational resource extraction. Caribbean and African nations often rely heavily on global markets, which can limit their policy choices. The fear expressed in independent speeches that sovereignty might be hollow without economic power still resonates. This is particularly poignant with China's growing influence across Africa and the Caribbean during the last 3 decades. Globalisation has also intensified cultural exchange, raising new questions about identity. Independence rhetoric emphasised recovering dignity after racial and cultural domination. In a global media environment dominated by powerful cultural industries, post-colonial societies continue to negotiate how to preserve local traditions while participating in global culture. Music, language, fashion, and migration create hybrid identities that challenge simple national narratives. For many African diasporas across the Americas and the Caribbean, the psychological dimension of independence, the struggle to define oneself rather than be defined by others, remains ongoing. Class inequality, a key theme of independence rhetoric, has also taken new forms under globalisation. While some post-colonial elites have benefited from integration into global markets, many working class populations still face unemployment, informal labour, and economic vulnerability. This echoes earlier fears that independence might replace foreign rulers with domestic elites without transforming economic structures. Modern political speeches in many Caribbean and African states still use the language of social justice, development, and fairness first articulated during decolonisation. At the same time, globalisation has created new opportunities for solidarity. Regional organisations, diaspora communities, and South South cooperation reflect the older dream of unity voiced by federation advocates and Pan Africanists. Caribbean integration efforts and African continental institutions continue the project of collective strength in a world dominated by large economic powers. The rhetoric has shifted from anti-colonial liberation to strategic cooperation, but the underlying goal, protecting autonomy in a global system, sounds familiar. Seen in this way, independence was not an end point, but the beginning of a long negotiation with global power. The speeches of the 1950s and 1960s framed sovereignty as dignity and self-determination. Today, globalisation tests how much of that vision can be realised in an interconnected world. However, the questions raised by independence leaders such as who controls resources, whose culture defines value, and who benefits from economic systems remain unresolved. Their rhetoric continues to provide a language for critiquing inequality and imagining alternative futures. If you liked this podcast, then stay on this listening platform, click the subscribe button and check out my other episodes related to this one, such as the previous episode, Is This How History Is Written? Also, Colonialism, Just a Thing of the Past, Parts 1 and 2 from the second season, and One Love or Many Perspectives, The Controversy of Bob Marley from the fourth. And don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, my stories or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Nights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. These are all available on the website in paperback, on Amazon in Kindle format, and in ebook format at Apple Books and all other digital platforms. Also, the publication of the latest 4 titles. Now, if you want to find out more, just visit storiestobetold.com and check out the learning platforms for The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong, Bite from the Big Apple, A Story for New York, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, and A Story for South Africa. And if you'd like to sign up to my email list, just visit the website where you can opt in and receive your free samples of my first 4 titles. And finally, remember that you can also send me an audio message on the SpeakPipe link, which is also in the show notes, so don't be a stranger. Feel free to like, follow and share us on social media when you visit the website. Just click onto whichever social media link you would like to follow us on. And as always, it is a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. I'm Tracy DW, and this is a Stories to be Told podcast. Stay safe, stay well, stay blessed. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next page.